Dungeons are one of my favorite ways to experience World of Warcraft. They're fun, challenging, and group you up with other players. But I still recall the first time I ever entered a dungeon and the fear I had of doing something wrong. My name is Swag, and today I'm going to help you get into your first dungeon and be confident that you know what to do. We're going to go over what you can expect in the dungeon, the different roles you can play for your group, and how to even join a dungeon in the first place. World of Warcraft contains over 100 dungeons and is constantly adding more. So what then even is a dungeon? Well, to start, it's a sectioned off area of the game known as an instance for 5 players to work together towards a common goal. Some dungeons are open fields and others are dark, winding hallways. Each has its own thematic flavor. Fight through hordes of assassins hiding out in abandoned mines, or take on time-traveling pirate dragons in order to get some loot, some gear, experience, and gold. Each dungeon you enter will contain 2 types of enemies. The first type and most common type are known as mobs, although many players will call them trash. These will be scattered all throughout the dungeon and oftentimes come in packs. They're fairly easy to handle on their own, but in large groups can become extremely dangerous. Technically, you don't even have to kill them to complete the dungeon, and they're usually not dropping worthwhile loot. But because they're in the way, you're gonna have to take care of them. The other type of enemy that you will encounter in the dungeon is bosses. There are usually about 3 to 5 bosses per dungeon, and these do drop loot, which is extremely helpful, but also know that they're a lot harder to kill and require more technical skill from the player. Make sure before entering combat with the boss that all players are present in the room. It is very common for a boss battle to lock the room down once the fight starts. If you die during a boss battle, you will be unable to release your spirit until that battle ends. If you're looking for information on each particular boss battle, you can open the adventure guide found in the bottom right menu of your screen in order to look at the abilities and loot pools of each boss in that dungeon. Bosses do drop loot, and they are required to complete a dungeon, so unlike the trash, you cannot skip them most of the time. If you're unfamiliar with the layout of a dungeon or the location of the bosses, you can press M or open up your map to see where the bosses are located, the layout of the dungeon, and where doorways can be found to take you to other parts of the dungeon. It is also critical in dungeons to be aware of your feet. There are a lot of enemy abilities that will show on the ground before they actually hit. So I'll go over what some of the most common ones are, but it's generally safe. If you see something, get out of it. Cones are an enemy attack that will hit in front of them. The best way to avoid this is just to not stand near your tank, as the cone will usually go out right onto the tank. A swirly indicates that an attack is about to hit in that location, so if you see one, move out of it. And of course, if you see fire, get out of the fire. It's pretty self-explanatory. Every character that enters a dungeon has a specific role to play. This role is determined by the specialization of your character. If you've seen my previous beginner guides videos, you'll have heard of these roles, but today let's go over in more detail the roles of the tank, the damage dealer, also known as a DPS, and the healer. Each dungeon group will be made up of 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 1 healer. If you're not sure what role your specialization plays, you can take a look in the specialization window in-game. The role of the tank is to hold the attention of any enemies your group is in combat with. This is known as threat or aggro. Enemies will focus on whoever has the most threat. You can use abilities like taunt to force enemies to attack you and build threat, but as a tank, simply dealing damage will build more threat than your teammates can build. As a tank, it is crucial that you are using abilities that help you survive. These can be blocks, shields, damage reductions, or even self-heal. Since tanks are the first to enter combat, they are also expected to set the pace for the group and know the route that they want to take in the dungeon. The role of the DPS is pretty straightforward. You want to deal as much damage as you can to burn down your enemies quickly. However, there are some things you should know. The more damage you deal means the faster that fight will go. However, no matter how fast you want to go, do not start pulling enemies as the DPS. You're going to pull aggro onto yourself and you will die, or you'll create a more difficult experience for the rest of your team. Not only do you deal damage, but there are other mechanics in the dungeon that you often need to be aware of. One of those is interrupts. If you see an enemy casting with a green spell bar, that means that you can use an interrupt spell to stop that cast. This can really help out your group, help your healer, and make things easier for your tank. If you are new to dungeons, this is the role that I would suggest. Playing as a DPS gives you a safer environment for learning the mechanics of a dungeon. Healers are the life force of your group. The healer's main role is in the title. They are there to heal the group and keep them alive during encounters. Not only should they be healing, but healers also want to watch out for things like debuffs being cast onto their teammates. You can use your dispels in order to remove those debuffs and keep your teammates alive in ways other than healing. Make sure while you're healing that you're also keeping an eye on your own mana. Every healer class has more mana conservative spells. Make sure you know which ones you want to use majority of the time and which spells are really only for extreme situations. And of course, carry some food with you as well. You never know when you need to take a quick break just to build that mana back up. And as a healer, it is crucial that you understand player priority. Don't be so focused on your tank or your DPS that you ignore yourself and you end up going down. Because if you go down, the whole group goes down. So you want to prioritize yourself first, and then probably your tank second. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, there's no better way to learn than getting into a dungeon. If you click on the group finder icon in the bottom right corner of your screen, it will open up a window. By default, it should already be set to dungeons. Now, there's going to be a drop-down window in there with different dungeon difficulties and dungeons from different expansions, but just leave it to the default settings. You're going to want to click on your icon that relates to the role that you'd like to play, and then join the queue. When the queue is ready, it will teleport you into the dungeon. If the group was already working on a dungeon and had a player leave, it is possible that you could be brought into a partially completed dungeon. Don't worry, just keep on going with the rest of the group. As you saw in the Dungeon Finder window, there are multiple different difficulties of dungeons. Normal dungeons are what you will do while you're leveling and when you first hit max level. The difficulty of these dungeons will scale with your level, so you don't have to worry there. But once you've hit max level and you've geared up a little bit, then you'll be able to do heroic dungeons. They're very similar to normal, but more difficult and better loot. However, Mythic and Mythic Plus dungeons operate differently. In order to do those, you have to form a group manually and go to the entrance of that dungeon out in the world. However, I will do a separate video talking about Mythic and Mythic Plus, so keep an eye out for that. Once you've completed the dungeon, right-click your profile picture in-game and click Leave Instance Group. This will now teleport you back to where you were, and that's it. You're now ready to get into your first dungeon. Of course, if you still have any questions, feel free to comment them below or join our Discord community. There is a link in the description of this video, and we would be happy to help you get into your first dungeon and create a fun and exciting experience. Otherwise, why don't you check out one of these videos over here, and I will see you next week.